eye tracking and dynamic foveated rendering, something that has been hyped up by the VR community for quite a while, and for good reason, because in theory, this is something that would let you render only the full detail of the game where you're looking at while reducing it outside your focus to improve performance dramatically. Even big companies like Oculus's own Michael Abresh hyped up this technology by making insane claims about it way back in 2016 and even made quite optimistic predictions on when it'd be mainstream.
I'm sure all of you can appreciate how much easier it would be to hold frame rate if you only had to render 1/10 the pixels. But my prediction is that foveated rendering will be a core VR technology in 5 years.
But 7 years later, and this is what some of our eye tracking lineup looks like. So, their timeline was quite a premature prediction. Eye tracking is still either niche or on the pretty expensive end. But what about the performance hype even when it does work? Well, that's what we're going to be taking a look at today, and the reason you're here, as I've got a couple of benchmarks covering foveated rendering. But before we jump into them, there are a few things we have to talk about first to give context on how this works and why we'll see the results that we do. See, there are multiple ways which you can do foveated rendering, because the base concept is simply having the full detail where your gaze is, because the fovea of the eye, hence the name foveated rendering, and where you see full resolution, so to speak, is a rather tiny area. The idea of foveated rendering works on the same principle our eyes already do. You can reduce the detail in the peripheral of your vision within the game, but the way you accomplish this can vary. We're only going to be focusing on 2 of those methods today, though, as they're the 2 which you, the viewer, can actually access and use. The 2 in question are, number 1, variable rate shading, which is the current most popular method used by Pimax, the OpenXR toolkit, and the VR Perf kit to achieve either dynamic or fixed foveated rendering. And the second one is known as quad views rendering. Both have the same end goal, but the method for getting it is quite different. We're going to look at VRS first before we get to quad views, though. That will be a bit later in the video. So then, what is variable rate shading? In very simple terms, think of it like how various effects, such as shadows, for example, could typically apply to every pixel, but with VRS, you may do something such as apply it only to a certain area of the pixels to save performance on the effects while maintaining image quality. Here's a visualized example from NVIDIA of how it works. The technology is used in flat screen gaming already, but it has pretty useful applications in VR. Because using the principles of foveated rendering, you could apply lower levels of pixel shading to your peripheral view while maintaining the full amount in your focus view, thus reducing the graphical demands in that part of the render pipeline. This is not really the same as flat out downsampling the whole resolution though, but the advantages of this method are that it's one of the easier ones to use, at least from an injection standpoint, but it is still not universal. As of the almost 60 games I tested with the Crystal, a little bit over half of them worked. The VR Perf kit was similar to that. Some games which worked with the Perf kit didn't exactly work with Pimax, but some which worked with Pimax didn't work with the VR Perf kit. And then the OpenXR toolkit is OpenXR only. The downsides to this are, firstly, that you need to have an NVIDIA RTX card to use VRS in most cases here. You need it for Pimax, you need it for the VR Perf kit, and you need it for most titles with the OpenXR toolkit, because AMD only supports VRS with DirectX 12, and most VR games are DirectX 11. Pimax's and the VR Perf kits also only works with OpenVR titles, not OpenXR, where you want to use the OpenXR toolkit for that. Secondly, since this method deals with only pixel shading, if you end up bottlenecked by something other than pixel shading on your GPU, well, you're not going to see any benefits because this only reduces that workload. Generally, this form of foveation sees the most gains when it comes to having a lot of effects, because complex effects such as lighting and shadows are typically quite heavy on pixel shading. Because of this, you may end up with some very different results depending on your GPU horsepower. And it's because of this I have 2 systems which we're going to be testing with today. Test configuration wise, the first system has a 7950X3D, RTX 4090, and 6000 MHz CL30 DDR5 RAM. This ran the Crystal at 4312 by 5100 per eye at 120 Hz mode. Maxed out settings unless noted otherwise, save for AA, see my other video if you want a full analysis of why. My second system them was an Alienware X17R2 laptop with an RTX 3080 Ti GPU, mobile version of course, 12900 HK CPU, and 4800 MHz CL40 DDR5 RAM, which ran the Crystal at the same resolution, except only at 90 Hz and generally on high settings instead of max, save for one game where I had to lower the resolution, which I did note. I tested with fixed foveated rendering using Pimax's implementation on the highest setting, the VR Perf kit at stock settings here, and then the OpenXR toolkit at stock as well, when applicable. Then for the dynamic foveated rendering, I also use Pimax's implementation and the OpenXR toolkits when applicable, since the VR Perf kit cannot do DFR. Same presets. Now, this all said and out of the way, let's get to the benchmarks. To kick off the VRS benchmarks, I have an updated Skyrim run through, as the minimalistic overall had a big 2.0 update, which changed quite a lot, such as switching to community shaders with Glamour Reshade instead of ENB as the default. For this, I could only test with Pimax's foveated rendering and not the VR Perf kits, as the VR Perf kits FFR causes weird artifacting in the middle of the screen that I'm showing right now. But under these conditions, foveated rendering on the 4090 isn't as big of a pro as you might think if you've seen some of my other videos. I am running this on 0.60 FSR scale, have disabled the VRAM optimizations, and I'm using the DLAA sharpening, but otherwise I'm on stock settings for the mod in all conditions. And compared to the previous iterations of the mod, well, the results are rather disappointing. Looking at the averages, we only gained around 6% here using DFR versus no DFR. And here, both fixed and dynamic foveated rendering were within run-to-run variants of each other. And that's kind of the case for the whole run. There are some spots where we do see slightly higher. There's the Whiterun gate, which is always given good gains, and we saw around plus 16% going by frame times, so sometimes foveated rendering can add a bump now. But in general, there isn't a whole lot. One thing I do want to point out on top of all this though is, again, if you've seen my other videos, is that the CPU frame times are significantly improved compared to previous iterations of the mod. Foveated rendering does add a noticeable relative CPU load increase, but we are still so GPU bound, the CPU frame times would have to almost double to become a problem. But things kind of get worse for foveated rendering here. We're not done. Skyrim has this very odd bug with FR that when you initially load into an area, everything foveates fine. No issues, and 9 out of 10 times, I doubt you'd notice much. But if you travel around a bit and then go back to the same area, this happens. The foveation gets incredibly obvious. It is every bit as bad inside the headset as it looks here. The worst offenders are the trees, and it is incredibly distracting. However, this appears to only happen in the daytime. Going to night and doing the same test, it can be seen everything is so much less noticeable. The foveation feels truly invisible under those conditions. And this just appears to be a fundamental problem with Skyrim. It was the same problem on a completely vanilla install. No idea how to fix it or if it can be fixed. But unfortunately, at least on the 4090 and with this mod pack, foveated rendering just isn't that beneficial here, and if you are truly starved for performance, sure, some teams may provide an uplift. At plus 16%, the Whiterun gate was noticeable, but sometimes the artifacting is just really bad and might take you out of the experience. And now we check out the 3080 Ti laptop, which is running the more lightweight Fuss mod pack. This is a much lower end GPU, so we gotta know our limits. This one was a bit strange, as I could not enable foveated rendering with reshade enabled. It would crash every time, but reshade worked fine with foveated rendering on my 4090, so I don't know. The VR Perf kit also didn't play nicely with this one either, and I had to bite the bullet and just go with balanced res 3232 by 3824 per eye, because even when using upscalers, they just couldn't save me, and the performance on screen should already be indicative of a struggle. Here, results are more favorable for foveated rendering though. With DFR, a near 19% increase was seen on average, and it did a few percent better than FFR, but still very close. And in front of the Whiterun gate, we see around plus 27% with foveated rendering compared to none, which is a pretty massive gain. Here, foveated rendering is a noticeable edge because there were points where, without it, you could not even maintain 45 FPS reprojection even when factoring the recording penalty, whereas with it, you'd never dip below that threshold. However, while some parts you could do 60 to 120 FPS reprojection with foveated rendering, there are still too many spots where you'd fail even when considering the recording penalty for me to recommend doing that. Still a good result for foveated rendering after the 4090 was a disappointment. And now we get to another benchmark of VR visuals, Half-Life Alyx, run with all max settings and only MSAA times 2 on the 4090. Because strangely, Pimax has a bug where MSAA times 4, the game becomes very pixelated and appears to foveate where you look instead, which is unusable. But everything works fine on MSAA times 2, so that's what we're using, and I will be largely looking at frame timings because of it and being so hertz limited. Dynamic resolution was also disabled for all of them, naturally. Also want to note the VR Perf Kit does not have this issue, but MSAA times 4 is just generally not worth it at this resolution anyway. Visual quality wise, Alyx has perhaps the most unnoticeable injection of foveated rendering, at least for variable rate shading, out of any game I tested, and it was a no-brainer to turn on. However, despite the fact all 3 forms of foveated rendering are giving so much headroom, you could do 144 Hz on the crystal if it had it enabled. DFR still adds value here though, as since lenses like the crystals are so clear, the static and fixed nature does still sometimes stand out in certain shots, even as good as it works with Alyx. Whereas with DFR, I felt like the foveated rendering was a best case and basically invisible, which did improve the emergent experience noticeably. But anyway, in Alyx, all 3 forms of foveated rendering are basically locked 120 Hz. Even without foveated rendering, I'd be doing locked 120 if I wasn't recording. So there is not a whole lot to talk about. Though I will also note there was a very high relative increase with Pimax's DFR in the CPU, but the frame times are so good you need to be pushing almost 1000 FPS to run into issues. But there is one very interesting find here relating to GPU performance. Near the end of the level, you get scanned by a robot, which causes a massive drop in FPS without foveated rendering. It only lasts a couple seconds, so I'm going to freeze frame here because, oh boy, this is kind of huge. Well, on average, we saw less than a 20% improvement in this one scene, one moment lasting mere seconds. We saw upwards of plus 50% performance. Not only that, DFR performs significantly above both FFR conditions. DFR is no longer just better for immersion, but it's giving better performance too. This may only be a few seconds long, so it's not going to impact the user experience all that much, but the fact this is even possible is incredibly interesting. And if something like this did happen even just occasionally, it could add up to be a noticeably better experience going through levels. Checking out the laptop, we are playing on the high fidelity preset with MSAA times 2 because again, we gotta know our limits on a laptop. Here, foveated rendering is again a massive boost, providing over plus 30% on average between no FR and DFR, whereas FFR was a bit over plus 20% without any foveated rendering. DFR is also doing notably better, around plus 8% over FFR, which is outside run-to-run variance. We are still not doing that great at FPS though, but with foveated rendering, this is at least a playable experience without reprojection. When considering recording, it's the difference between a 45 to 60 FPS experience or 45 FPS reprojection and 60 to 75 FPS or 60 FPS to 120 reprojection. There are even some points where we hit 90 FPS with foveated rendering where we're barely 70 without it. And DFR edges out a win here as it stays at 90 FPS in the same scenes where fixed foveated rendering just can't quite keep up. I would still likely use the FSR mod or dial down things a little bit more to hit 75 to 90 FPS more reliably if I wasn't using 60 FPS reprojection though. But for something that's around desktop 3070 tier, this is a pretty impressive result. Interestingly, when getting scanned by the robot, everything is getting brought to their knees, and we see far less of a gap than the 4090 had. But there are still some notable gains from foveated rendering, and DFR maintains a bit of a lead. Up next, we have Aircar in the 4090 tested with all maxed out settings here. And you can probably notice right away we are totally capped at 120 Hz even without DFR and have a lot of headroom going by frame times. But I chose this title for a specific reason. If we are going by frame times, we're getting a little under a plus 30% improvement on GPU performance. And because we're already maxed out, your first thought might be, well, why not raise the super sampling for sharper visuals when you have so much headroom? Well, notice what happens when I raise the super sampling value to 1.2 in-game. Firstly, the VR Perf Kit isn't here because it crashed trying to raise the in-game density to 1.2. But secondly, I'm now gaining basically nothing from foveated rendering. It's within run-to-run variance. As I mentioned in the cliff notes of how VRS works, if we end up bound by non-pixel shading GPU workloads, then lowering reducing the pixel shading workload will not do anything. And we're seeing that here on the 4090. So the on-paper gain at 100% sure is nice, but it doesn't really mean anything for us in the real-world usage, since we don't have above 120 Hz on the crystal yet, nor can we raise the super sampling with that extra headroom. But on the 3080 Ti laptop, the story is far different and is the best result I had for this. At maxed out settings and 100% resolution, there was a staggering plus 43% improvement with DFR compared to native. And we see some interesting differentiation in the methods. DFR was a few percent better than Pimax's FFR, but the VR Perf kit did noticeably worse than DFR and slightly worse than Pimax's FFR, with the FFR being around plus 6% ahead and DFR plus 13%. The 1% lows were also far behind both of them. However, on the other end, the CPU frame times had far better averages and 1% lows than Pimax's implementation. In a game like Aircar, lower FPS is fine, but FPS around 70 feels so much better than 50, let me tell you. This would also be the difference between 45 FPS reprojection and 60 FPS reprojection if you were relying on that. And now we have an open XR game, Phasmaphobia. This is tested on maxed out settings with the 4090, except for AAA set 2x2. This can't be used with Pimax's nor the VR Perf kit's Foveated Rendering, so we are using the OpenXR toolkit here for DFR and FFR. I've also brightened up the game as much as I could, so hope it's not too dark to see anything. Going into an actual map, the Big Abandoned High School, we have some quite notable gains. Fixed and dynamic Foveated Rendering produced roughly the same gains, yes, but those gains were still incredibly significant at almost plus 26% performance. If I wasn't recording, Foveated Rendering would be the difference between a 90 FPS and near 120 FPS experience, which is quite a nice thing to see after the other 4090 results were not so great. Frame rate did improve for both when going up to a higher floor, but the relative difference did remain the same. And at least in this game, DFR didn't feel too impactful because you can barely see a damn thing to begin with without lights, but did feel very useful to have in areas with more lighting, so no reason to not use it if you have eye tracking. You may also note the CPU frame times improved here, but don't take away that CPU performance is being improved, as simply reducing pixel shading workloads doesn't impact the CPU. Let me explain. I spoke with the OpenXR toolkit developer about this, and they speculated among the reasons for this is that it could be the app may be poorly written and waiting on the GPU to finish its work. When the GPU works faster, the CPU is able to complete its work faster since it's waiting for less time on the GPU, the slower frame time, assuming that is what's going on. Or the app may be able to just start the next frame and calculate physics earlier, which reduces CPU frame times as well. In both cases, your CPU performance is not technically improving, so if you were truly CPU bound, turning on Foveated Rendering would not magically lift the CPU bottleneck here. But either way, after mostly low average gains on the 4090, seeing such an improvement is a welcome surprise. With the laptop, I had to really dial things back though, going to around medium settings, safer textures, and using the built-in FSR on ultra quality mode just to get anything that was even playable. Despite this, the results are even more impressive than with the 4090, seeing around plus 38% performance with Foveated Rendering versus without it. The CPU is getting hammered hard too by the game in all conditions, but we are still largely GPU bound with only a few small CPU bound spikes. Once again, this is enough of a gain to be a transformative experience. This is the third title with this mobile 3080 Ti, again around desktop 3070 levels, where Foveated Rendering would be the difference between 45 and 60 FPS reprojection. And even without reprojection, I'd consider 60 FPS, which we'd constantly be above at without recording, at least playable versus 45, even if not really that great, and I'd still want to have higher frames. And lastly, we have Saints and Sinners Chapter 2, which was one of the most confusing and frustrating tests I ran. But I have to include it because of some of the unique behavior that which I've not seen anywhere else, and why we're also going to be taking a look at the 3080 Ti laptop first on these things on screen. You see that black artifacting in the peripheral here? This happened on 2 different systems, and it's quite distracting. But watch what happens when I adjust the resolution slider. It just disappears, and it doesn't come back even when changing it again. But my Foveated Rendering gains got completely kneecapped. This happened on both my systems, and restarting, reinstalling the game, nothing would bring back the original behavior. I have absolutely no idea why it happened in the first place, and this resulted in some wildly different gains on the laptop we gotta talk about. To illustrate the point, here's a quick run through I did with the bugged behavior. As can be seen, the gains from Foveated Rendering, DFR in particular, are astronomical here. A near 50% increase on the averages. But this comes at the cost of having the most noticeable and distracting artifacting out of any game I tested. Even worse than Skyrim when backtracking, because certain elements just end up blacked out entirely. It's so bad inside the headset. It's as bad as it looks on screen. And this is not Pimax's fault either. This happens with the VR Perf kit as well. Any form of foveated rendering caused this for me. So, yes, the improvement is incredible, but the artifacting, again, it's just so bad. And because of how I could not replicate this again, even when deleting all traces of the game and reinstalling it and going through every possible setting, I cannot be certain if this is the default behavior and something you just permanently break adjusting resolution scale, or just some odd glitch that somehow happened on both my systems. When I redid the benchmarks with the artifacting fixed, oh sure, the foveated rendering was borderline invisible compared to before. But now the gains were also nearly nothing and all over the place. The best result was Pimax's FFR, which provided just under 10% gains, going from 58 to 63 FPS. But DFR, while technically seeing a few percent gains, saw less than either form of FFR did, which is the only time I've ever seen this. So far, DFR has usually provided a slight edge over FFR at best or been equal at worst, but not here. So, if you get this bug, and you can tolerate the artifacting, then just don't adjust the in-game resolution slider if you get big gains, I guess. But then we move on to the 4090, and I'm getting even more goddamn confused. This was run at all max settings, including AA, because I was so hertz limited without it. I'm not even gonna bother showing the bug playthroughs, as for some reason the 4090 saw no changes between having it and not. It was like a 1 to 2% difference at best, and that's not an improvement, that's system noise. But for some reason, now DFR is actually providing about plus 4% performance, whereas both forms of FFR are essentially identical on averages, so you'd think it's basically useless. But Pimax's FFR has an improvement outside run-to-run variance on the lows, and that happened with multiple runs I did. But then you have times where foveated rendering, at least from Pimax, is doing about the same, sometimes even a bit less, whereas then the VR Perf kit's doing upwards of 10% better, even a little bit more. So I'm just really perplexed about this game. I would probably not even bother using foveated rendering, though, with it on the 4090, maybe the 3080 Ti mobile, since at least that got almost 10% gains from FFR. I guess this is sometimes what happens when you're doing injection-based methods. Sometimes you might find wild glitches like this. It would just be so much easier if devs would natively support this stuff.
So, those are the VRS benchmarks. Some interesting results, but we're not going to get to the conclusions quite yet because now we have to cover the other major form of foveated rendering for this video, that being quad views. Now, quad views works quite differently from how VRS does. It essentially renders multiple views per eye, hence the name. It kind of looks something like this. One of these views, the larger one, is the full FOV, but it renders as a much slower resolution than your target. The full fidelity image is reserved for the much smaller box that you see overlaying the big one. By rendering a lower resolution peripheral view and then a higher resolution focus view, you can save a bunch of performance, since you're only rendering at high fidelity levels in the tiny little box. And when it's dynamic, the box moves with your eyes, so you have the full detail everywhere you look. You can do this via fixed foveated rendering manner as well, but it's less effective. Now, because we're flat out lowering the resolution everywhere outside the focus view, this affects more than just the pixel shading workload, and so the kind of gains you can get from it have the potential to be much higher. Plus, this also works with AMD and the few apps which support it. It's not all good though. There are some notable limitations to this technique. Firstly, as you're rendering the scene twice per eye, that also means you're rendering the geometry twice. This means the CPU load can end up increasing quite notably in some instances. Typically, Thankfully, this is not a severe problem because at super high resolutions like VR, you have far more CPU load to spare than you do GPU. However, if you have a weak CPU but strong GPU, it could be possible you end up not getting much performance out of it if the bottleneck's bad enough. Secondly, there are several visual effects which do not play nicely with quad views, and trying to use quad views with it it doesn't work. Here's an example from Zero Caliber where the focus screen is completely blacked out due to incompatible effects like ambient occlusion. Here is also a quick list of effects which are a no-go for this as well. Most not too bad, but there are some notable ones. Thirdly, because of how much more complex this method is, you can't really inject it into a game that easily without proper support. At the time of this recording, there are only 2 games which properly, or at least mostly, work with quad views. Those games are Pavlov and DCS. It is actually incredibly easy for game developers to add in quad views, and there is a literal plugin for Unreal Engine 5, and you can expose the functions in Unity with a few extra steps. On top of that, the game also needs to be OpenXR. You cannot do this with OpenVR. You can still do this with SteamVR though, thanks to a recent update to quad views and another program made by Mbusha, OpenXR eye trackers. Contrary to what some people think, SteamVR does have OpenXR support. He also wrote a pretty nice and in-depth article covering quad views if you wish to see a more thorough analysis of this technique, and I will be linking it in the description below. Highly recommend if you like technical details. Though I am using SteamVR, I have to talk about my methodology for testing quad views here, and I had to approach this a little differently for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there are only 2 games which support this, yes, and one of them is a multiplayer-focused game, so replicability in anything close to real-world usage is damn hard. And DCS just wouldn't work on my system with the multi-thread version, which is needed for quad views, so I really only had one multiplayer game to test with. But secondly, quad views with SteamVR at this time breaks the GPU frame time graph measurements in FPS VR, as you can see on screen right here. FPS counter seems to work in CPUs fine, but GPUs no good, so I couldn't use that. So I set up a RTSS overlay via MSI Afterburner to be kinda similar. This appears to capture the data correctly. It roughly lined up with the OpenXR toolkit's frame measurements. Unfortunately, I couldn't really show the CPU utilization since the text ended up too small as I have a 16-core 32-thread CPU. I am going to be taking a little more in-depth look at this with Pavlov though because of this, and I'm still figuring out how exactly I want to present this method. I couldn't exactly do like for like, but the differences are so vast here, believe me, it's still going to be pretty apparent. And because I kept things broadly similar, we can still do some general comparisons in specific scenes. But there was still some variance, so I take this as a general abstraction, give or take some percent. This all said, let's get to taking a look at Pavlov, starting with the 4090, where I dialed the resolution all the way up to 6096 by 7212 per eye. That's 200% in SteamVR, and I maxed out everything except AA because at this res, who needs it, right?
For this test, I did Team Deathmatch on a fixed 10-minute timer, install and grab with bots at 200% res using FFR, DFR, no foveated rendering, and then 100% with MSA x4 and DFR just to show why you may as well super sample. In the opening walk, which was near identical in each, so we can compare a bit here, we're already seeing some differentiation and going to use this as a bit of a baseline. 200% with no FR is struggling to maintain even 60 FPS. FFR is hitting around 90 and about plus 60% no FR, whereas DFR is about 105, literally almost 2x performance right now. The 1% lows have not changed much, but the 0.1% lows on DFR are much better right now, before 200% at least. Getting into some actual shooting in a similar spot, any Foveation is bringing massive benefits. Checking the current FPS for the 200% range, this was at different points in the match, so not checking lows much right now. If not recording, this is basically the difference between a 60, 90, and 120 FPS experience comparing none, FFR, and DFR. FFR is giving us nearly an 80% boost, whereas DFR is literally almost plus 130% performance. Even a bit more because we're hertz limited in this spot. I just love to see it. Checking another similar-ish spot, God, I wish multiplayer was easier to benchmark. We're seeing a kind of a similar story. DFR at 200% is doing over 2x better than no DFR, whereas FFR is kind of around plus 50% no foveation. Less than the other spots, but still a substantial boost. MSAA, as expected, is just cruising through without issues and has a good bit of headroom. Now, I'll just flash through some scenes from the run here as well to illustrate the broad point. As even if these scenes aren't one-to-one comparable, we're sort of seeing a trend emerging here between no foveated rendering and having it. At 200%, not having quad views is basically a 60 FPS experience were I not recording.
But even then, there are points where it dips below that briefly. Whereas even without eye tracking, the 4090 is seeing a gigantic leap in performance from FFR alone. You could have a good and incredibly stable 90 FPS experience on the Crystal at this crazy high resolution. Even the 1% lows consistency versus 90 FPS is simply incredible. But DFR is the true king here. Despite the same base method being used, having eye tracking lets limits be further pushed, and now the 4090 is capable of delivering a reasonably good 120 FPS experience on this map. The overall boost to average FPS was about 2x, but as we saw, there are some scenes where we go way higher than even that. The difference here is actually greater than going from something like a 3080 to a 4090. There were some oddities in the lows due to how I could not one-to-one benchmark here. I ran through this a few times on each condition to try and get something similar, and it didn't vary too much, but the 0.1% lows saw the most variance, where sometimes they change by around 10%, whereas the average FPS and 1% lows typically change less than around 10%. What is worth noting, though, is that while there was a noticeable, but not extreme, fidelity improvement over 200% with no AA versus 100% with MSA times 4, the latter had far tighter 1% lows, and this was a consistent thing I found. I would say that the 1% and 0.1% lows at 200% with Foveation are more than fine here, especially at 90 Hz. But frame rate consistency is vital in VR, and so somebody may prefer native res with MSAA for that, or maybe something like 175% instead of 200. Either way, this truly feels like I'm looking at the future of graphical performance with these results. But what about something lower end? Will it see as much of a gain? Let's take a look at the 3080 Ti laptop with a 12900 HK CPU. With the opening March, no quad views is hovering around 50 FPS, while FFR is about 60, only about plus 20%. Though DFR is hovering around 70, which is about plus 40% from no Foveation, and then around plus 16 from FFR. Though all slightly improve as the group walk away from spawn, and then back down a bit during combat. Interesting to note is DFR is running at a slightly higher frequency and temps on the CPU, indicating a greater load there, while FFR is running at a much higher frequency and even hitting 100C, which is reaching thermal throttle territory. The GPU utilization is similar in all of them, but it does sometimes drop a few percent lower with quad views, so part of the reason for lower than expected gains could be that we have a slight CPU bottleneck here. The FFR behavior here was surprisingly consistent, even when I ran this test multiple times. Possibly due to having a larger focus view with FFR where the geometry is being rendered twice, though this shouldn't result in that significant change, but at least on the laptop here, the CPU is definitely working a lot harder. Jumping a little ahead, the frame rate's pretty consistent with the opening crawl, sitting around 50 or lower without Foveation, while DFR and FFR are in the low 70s to 60s respectively. But there are times where DFR dips to around the same FPS as FFR has, alongside GPU utilization dropping, which again could indicate a possible CPU bottleneck. Checking the spot which gave the most gains on the 4090, we have some interesting behavior. No Foveation is again sitting around 50, very stable too, whereas FFR is about 65, give or take a few FPS, with around plus 30% performance and sometimes utilization dipping below 90. DFR is a bit spikier, varying from around 75 to 80 FPS, but sometimes dipping to near 70. But we're seeing around plus 50% versus no Foveation here and plus 15 versus FFR, which is again consistent with other areas. In general, gains on the 3080 Ti laptop were a lot lower than with the 4090, but part of that seems to be CPU bottlenecking. However, even despite this, the boost was still noteworthy. On the averages, FFR only provided about plus 25% performance over no Foveation, but DFR doubled that to nearly plus 50%, and we saw it pull notably ahead in some scenes, which is a meaningful difference. Unfortunately, while the lows did improve, it just wasn't enough to hit 90 FPS in the end, though. If the Crystal had a 75 Hz mode, then that would be quite doable with DFR enabled under these conditions, when not recording at least. Which I still find impressive for a GPU of this level driving this resolution with MSAA. Still, to get 90 FPS, you'd either have to drop the resolution or settings somewhat. You could also disable MSA entirely using the low setting in Pavlov, but that only gave me around 10 to 15% performance on the laptop with quad views. But what about how noticeable the Foveation is? Well, it's quite hard to notice. I think it's less noticeable than with VRS. If you actively try to find it, you can under certain conditions like the shooting range here, But at 200% res on the 4090, this also increases the peripheral resolution, so artifacts become even less noticeable. And even pixel peeping, good luck seeing that inside the headset. However, Pavlov does still have one notable visual glitch with quad views, but I would think it's somewhat minor. You may have noticed in the Stalingrad footage that when getting shot, there would be a red box around the center on screen as with FFR. Without quad views, the damage effect appears properly around all your vision, but with quad views, it also appears on the focus screen. This does work to show how tiny the focus screen truly is, though. Here is the DFR screen size for comparison to FFR. So for quad views to be as unnoticeable as it is quite impressive, and you could have room to further tweak and adjust the settings if you so want. Other than that, Pavlov seemed to work perfectly for me.
And there we have it. That's all the DFR benchmarks and the technical explanations out of the way, so let's go over some conclusions and general takeaways. Starting with variable rate shading base, which is the current popular method for FR, there's a few key points. Firstly, you generally don't gain much between dynamic and fixed foveated rendering, so if you just want extra performance, you can go ahead and get that right now, even without eye tracking. And there are still a few cases where having DFR did provide a slight uplift over FFR, though. And when it comes to the visual quality and immersion, dynamic foveated rendering is a noticeable improvement when you have clear lenses like the Crystal. On older headsets with much worse edge-to-edge clarity, the blurring in the peripheral might not matter as much, and so you might not end up seeing it too big of a difference. The big pro here is that DFR improves the immersion by making it less noticeable. Secondly, the thing is that even if it may provide only modest gains on average, there are still some edge cases where having foveated rendering can provide otherworldly gains, even in scenes that last just mere seconds, like when DFR shot to almost 50% better versus no foveation in Alyx for a few seconds. So if the foveation is unnoticeable to you, it's probably worth leaving on all the time just for situations like that. Though Pimax seems to generally come with somewhat of a CPU load increase, so you may want to keep an eye on that for certain games. Thirdly, it seems like the lower end your hardware is, the more you benefit. This is normally where I'd show a chart, but because of how I had to switch between FPS and frame times in some cases due to hertz limitations, along with how variable this was in scene to scene, I think it's better to just summarize. With the current king of GPUs, the 4090, it was honestly rather mixed bag. In some cases, it barely gained 6% on average and caused notable artifacting in Skyrim, but then other times you had stuff like Phasmaphobia where we saw a 26% improvement on the averages. That was the difference between 90 and 120 FPS there. But then there's the 3080 Ti laptop where the smallest gains were almost 20% performance, with the largest being plus 43%, way more than what the 4090 got. Well, yes, the laptop was still too weak to reliably do native 100% resolution on the Crystal at 90 Hz. In most cases, Foveation was enabling it to hit some rather important thresholds, such as 45 to 90 or 60 to 120 reprojection, when it would fail otherwise. Unfortunately, as this is still injection-based, sometimes you run into problems and glitches, like everything I covered with Saints and Sinners, or where the VR perf kit just crashed trying to raise Aircar to 1.2 density. I would generally say DFR is the best of both performance and visuals. We saw a few times where it squeaked ahead of FFR, but FFR can definitely still be worth using. As for quad views, well, this is a much different story and the opposite of VRS. It seems like the better your equipment is, the more you benefit from it. The 4090 got to truly flex when paired with the 7950X3D and didn't appear to have any noticeable CPU bottleneck. I was able to push the Crystal's resolution to 200% in Steam VR, while gaining over 2x performance with DFR on average. In some locations, that shot up as high as plus 130% versus no foveation. Let that sink in. Those gains are just actually game-changing. Revolutionary, even. I know people abuse that word so much it feels like it's lost its meaning, and even I hate to use it lightly. But there is no other term that fits such a monumental jump, and I truly mean it. Anything without eye tracking is almost DOA for me at the high end. If even 5 games I play regularly supported this, then it would be without question. Even with FFR, I still got around plus 65% with it, and it would have let me do rock steady 90 FPS at 200% res. In this case, there is a meaningful difference between DFR and FFR. Yes, you can adjust the stock settings to match if you want, but the point of DFR is that it's unnoticeable, or at least mostly so. But it's still worth using even if you don't have eye tracking. At least with the good stuff. The 3080 Ti laptop saw a lot less notable gains. FFR was meaningful but not transformative, only providing about plus 30, but DFR was nearly plus 50. Sometimes a little higher in certain scenes, and while it's not 2x performance, plus 50% is still like a generational leap and a half.
half. Part of that appears to be CPU constraints though, since there were times my utilization got rather low on the GPU and my FPS spiked down. Perhaps a better CPU would have seen a little greater uplift. But it may not be worth using if you have a particularly bad CPU, because there's a chance you might just not gain much from it, unfortunately. And there is the analysis and the benchmarks. I hope you found something useful here. There was a lot to cover and talk about. I kept running into some oddities that merited further investigation. Foveated rendering may not be what was hyped up long ago, but it still has massive potential. Enough that I think more devs need to take notice of this and consider adding it. Even just FFR can do a lot. If you enjoyed the video, consider sticking around to see what I do next. Not sure what that'll be, but this has been a pretty big project for me. But if you don't, thanks for stopping by, and maybe I will see you again sometime. Later.